Today on the Serial Port, we're awakening a beast. A 95-pound, Xeon-fueled, $24,000 7U rack mount server. This is the restoration of the Compaq ProLiant 6500. You might already be familiar with how we acquired our Total Control dial-up server from an abandoned ISP. But if not, please check out the story over at our second channel, the Parallel Port, linked here. But even if you are, you may not have realized that we also salvaged a Compaq server. Just under the Total Control in the ISP rack was this Compaq ProLiant 6500 with a CRT monitor sitting on top of it. The server, as well as the disk array underneath, had the drives removed, a disappointment for sure, but not a deterrent from bringing it back to the lab. There weren't many clues as to what this server was used for in the Dialstar infrastructure. It has a sticker on the front labeled svr03.dialstar.net, but that's it. Without the hard drives, it's impossible to know for sure what role it played. But any serious ISP in the mid to late 90s would have offered at least email service and web hosting for both residential and commercial customers, a role perfect for a server of this type. And there were loads of other services like Radius, DNS, NTP, and so on that were needed for an ISP's operation. Its imposing physical presence suggests this was clearly a serious piece of infrastructure. So without really any specific objective, we want to see if we can bring this machine back to life and find something era appropriate to demonstrate its power. After getting the unit back home, we set out to research exactly what we had. Compaq's ProLiant line goes back to 1993. In fact, Compaq claims that they actually made the world's first rack mount server in 1994. The 6500 was announced in 1997 as Compaq's new solution for what they called 7x24 computing. The original 6500 could be equipped with up to 4 Pentium Pro CPUs, but subsequent generations moved to a slot 2 architecture supporting Pentium 2 and Pentium 3 Xeons. So let's see what we have. Our 6500 has two 550 MHz Pentium 3 Xeons, each with 512 KB of cache. There is a corresponding power module for each CPU that Compaq called a quote, redundant processor power module, and there are blinking cartridges for the two empty CPU slots. This generation of the 6500 came with 256 megabytes of memory standard, which was plenty to be able to handle any operating system at the time. There are 5 64-bit PCI slots that are hot pluggable, a technology that Compaq themselves championed. The chassis supports up to 7 SCSI 3 drives that were also hot pluggable, along with beefy redundant 500-watt power supplies and a sweet LCD status screen on the front of the system. The prices for the servers varied wildly from what we were able to find. A national education price list showed the 6500 with 500 MHz P3 Xeons was around $10,000, so the retail price was presumably somewhat higher. We then found a couple of magazine articles with one configuration listed at $24,000 and the other at an unbelievable $75,000, nearly $140K in today's dollar.
I guess this big switch is it.
We documented our first attempts to power it on for our Patreon members. Our first attempt wasn't successful, as we saw an interlock LED illuminated on the motherboard indicating an issue. The 6500 doesn't have any chassis interlocks, so after reseating the CPUs, the interlock cleared and the system finally roared back to life for the first time in over a decade. We're seeing 256 megabytes of RAM and an invalid memory configuration error message, so we'll have to address that later on, but now that we know the server is actually in running condition, It's time to clean it up and get this beast back into action. After getting the disassembly started, it quickly turned into a dirty job requiring gloves. Everything in the chassis is covered in decades-old ISP dust, but we first start by removing the hot pluggable fans. The CPUs, power modules, and blinking inserts come out next. The memory is housed on a separate card that can accommodate 16 ECC EDO DIMMs, supporting up to 4 gigabytes total. At post, we only saw 256 megabytes recognized, but we have 8 64 megabyte modules installed, indicating we should be seeing 512 megabytes total, so we're not sure yet why half isn't being recognized. Next, the I/O card is removed, which contains the ATI Rage 2 GPU with 2 megabytes of memory. There's also a SCSI 3 controller and interfaces, as well as the keyboard, mouse, serial, and parallel interfaces. The hot pluggable PCI slots are operated using these clip mechanisms, and one immediately broke. The old plastic is very brittle, so I took more care when removing the others. The first card is a 64-bit PCI dual 10100 iBase board with Intel 8255A controllers. It has a cutout on the bracket and headers on the card, indicating this card could be upgraded with a 1 gigabit per second fiber interface. The remaining 2 cards are 3COM 3C905 10100 NICs. With those out of the way, the expansion card bracket can then be removed. And I should say I'm not really following any process here, rather just trying to strip the system from the top down. So next, I remove the side panel and the floppy cable and power. And then the rear panel can be removed. From there, the front LCD cable is removed, as well as the power switch and LED cables. Now the huge inner frame assembly can be taken out, which reveals the massive motherboard. After removing the remaining cable connections, the motherboard tray can be lifted out. The power switch and LED are disconnected, followed by removing the upper front chassis cover. The lower cover is then removed and the drive bay slides out. The LCD module is taken out, but not without some more broken plastic. Finally, the power backplane is removed, and we're left with an empty, nasty chassis desperately in need of a deep clean. After going through this process, it really illustrates to me just how and why these servers were so expensive. Every part is pretty much bespoke to this particular model. There is nothing standard here like you'd find in a mass-produced desktop PC of the era. The low volume, high complexity, and unique design all add up to produce a pretty remarkable piece of engineering. Cleaning the chassis parts was pretty simple. I used a mild soap and a brush before rinsing everything thoroughly. The resulting water really shows how nasty these parts were. ISP dust. For the PC boards, we tried using compressed air without much success. The ISP dust was simply caked on. So instead, I opted to use diluted ultrasonic cleaning solution and a scrub brush. The fans were arguably the dirtiest parts in the whole system. After removing the metal and plastic fan guards, the fan controller board with the hot plug assembly could be removed. Once fully disassembled, the fan guards and remaining pieces from the system were scrubbed clean. And after thoroughly drying, here are the final results. Before reassembly, we also wanted to clean up the power supplies. This assembly was relatively easy, and while they definitely weren't clean, they were in better shape than the rest of the system. They were blown out with compressed air, wiped down, and then reassembled. Next, we reassembled the fans. And now we're finally ready to get started. So now we're ready to install the CPUs and memory. but we only have 2 CPUs, and this server supports up to 4. Compaq offered upgrade kits that included the CPU and corresponding power module board, and amazingly, we found a retailer called Server Worlds that still had them in stock. And not just a few, but 128. They're listed as refurbished, so we're assuming their stock was simply scavenged from decommissioned servers. So we ordered 2 550 MHz CPU kits, and while we were at it, ordered a 1 GB memory kit to replace the existing memory. And here it is. It arrived pretty quickly, so let's go ahead and get it opened up and see exactly what we got. So it looks like we indeed have 2 CPUs here, as well as a memory kit. And then I think these are these must be the VRMs. So let's go ahead and take a look at the CPUs. So these are 550 megahertz CPUs with 512K of cache, which matches the ones that came with the server. Yeah, these look identical to the ones that came out of the server. I'm excited to get these into the ProLiant and see if we can get the quad CPUs working. And now that we have this server reassembled and upgraded, we're ready to power it on. Oh. Let's try one more time. it roars to life, and we can see the new CPUs and memory are recognized. Who knew such a beautiful system was hiding underneath all of that gunk and dust? With the top cover reinstalled, it was time to start on the next phase, installing and configuring an operating system. But before we can install an OS, we'll need a hard drive. The drives connect into a backplane with what we think is a proprietary Compaq connector, so we can't just install any SCSI hard drive. Luckily, we found a vintage Compaq 18.2 gigabyte SCSI drive with a caddy to try out. The interface carries both data and power, and when we insert the drive into the backplane, we see LEDs light up, indicating the drive is connected. The 6500 detects the drive during post.
Found it.
And now it seems to know we need an operating system and gives us a friendly but simple menu with several choices. The ProLiant officially supports a surprising number of operating systems out of the box with the usual suspects. And Banyan Vines and Citrix WinFrame? Back in this era, server management was very proprietary, and Compaq had their own ways of managing servers. The 6500 could be configured in any number of ways, including with disk arrays or in a cluster with multiple 6500s. Compaq simplified the configuration of the server with a tool called Smart Start, which dates back to the beginning of the ProLiant line. We couldn't find much info on exactly what it does, but we did find a thread indicating that it was a godsend that made things much easier. There were a couple of copies floating around, including version 4.2 on the Internet Archive that was from 1998, prior to the release of the P3 Xeon 6500. But we ended up finding a mirror of Compaq's FTP site in version 5.5 of Smart Start, which was released in the early aughts. Just to see what it does, we booted the server with the Smart Start CD. After selecting our language, we set a few date and time parameters, and then were asked to choose a path forward. We opted for the manual configuration to see if we could get a better idea of what this tool actually does. And now we need to decide about the operating system. We wanted to find an era-appropriate one for the server. We knew Linux was adopting SMP around this time, and a cursory search showed that the Linux kernel 2.0 supported SMP. And we actually already had a boxed copy of Red Hat Linux 5 released in 1997, which should support SMP. So let's take a look. After selecting Linux as our OS, the Smart Start tool goes through several steps, including creating a system partition that contains configuration, diagnostic, and maintenance tools. From there, it prompts us to insert the media for the operating system. And for disk partitioning, there's not an automatic setup like you'd find in any modern Linux distribution. We have to create some partitions manually. We weren't sure what the requirements are or if there might be maximum file system sizes to be concerned about. So we consulted the manual for guidance and came up with this layout. Now we're prompted to choose which components to install. And with our massive 18 gigabyte hard drive, we decided to splurge and try out some luxurious options, such as the Real Media client and server.
Graphic executables. Dial workstation, absolutely.
The installer prompts us to configure the network, but it doesn't automatically detect network cards. We figured out that the controller on our 64-bit PCI NIC matched the Intel Ether Express Pro driver in Linux, which there was built-in support for. After selecting Auto Probe, we can see on one of our virtual consoles that the EE Pro driver was initialized and has successfully detected the 2 ports on our NIC.
Yep, see, it's got the MAC,
Oh yeah.
2 Macs, BC and BD.
And they show up in ifconfig. After entering our IP details, we finish up the remaining steps in RedHat's installer. Fortunately, the system boots up without any problems into RedHat. And our network connection is working, but we only seem to have one CPU detected, and only 16 megabytes of RAM for some reason. Looking into this further, SMP support in Linux was considered experimental around this time, and it's not mentioned in the Red Hat 5 manual at all. So we'll likely need to install a kernel that supports SMP or compile a kernel ourselves. We didn't see any other kernel packages on the install CD, so we're going to compile one. We tried several different approaches to get SMP working with the 2.0.31 kernel, but each one ended in failure.
Okay.
Dang it. There is a file called smp.txt in the documentation directory, but it doesn't really contain any useful guidance on how to accomplish this. We then tried a newer kernel, the latest 2.0 release, which is 2.0.40. The key seems to be in the make file, where we can turn on SMP, which wasn't an option in the menu config.
Oh yeah, look at the kernel version. With that SP in there.
Yes. And finally, we have success. We not only see our full 1 gigabyte of memory, but we now see 4 processors detected, indicating our 4-way P3 Xeon Beast is ready for testing. We wanted to see SMP in action firsthand, So we thought a simple web server test would be a good demonstration of its capabilities. Apache HTTP server is already installed, and after a few troubleshooting steps, we have it running with start servers set to 10 and max clients at 150. Running Apache Bench from another machine on the LAN, the server handled 100,000 requests with a bit over 1,400 per second, with Linux distributing the load across the 4 CPUs. With that out of the way, we were itching to do something a bit more entertaining with all of this horsepower. One of our core memories from this time was gaming online, even with dial-up, playing Quake World. And Quake seems to go hand in hand with several other people's early ISP memories. Quake World was a slimmed-down version of Quake meant for optimized online play over the internet. And it has seen a resurgence. There are modern clients and servers available, but we want to keep it in the correct timeline. We sourced the latest Quake World server released by id Software in 1998, which was version 2.30. After some simple configuration, we launched the server and awaited the first players. We were able to connect from a vintage Windows 95 machine with the Quake World client. As well as a modern machine running EasyQuake. This instantly brought back so many good memories of Quake and the online community that surrounded it. And while this isn't taking advantage of the SMP capabilities of the ProLiant, we could do so by running multiple Quake World servers, maybe each with a different mod. But we want to hear what you think. Please consider supporting our mission and letting us know what you'd like to see next for the ProLiant. This ProLiant 6500 was forgotten, left in a vacated and abandoned room that once helped run a small dial-up ISP. Riddled with decades of dust, it was a stroke of luck that we were able to find it, and with a little work, bring it back to its former glory. And the story is not over for the 6500. It will no doubt find a place in our own dial-up ISP in the months to come. Until then, thanks for watching the Serial Port, and we'll see you next time.